Greetings, Professor Bolton.
We're in.
Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. One of the reasons that Wargames still holds up so well is that it got one very important thing right. Not the details, mind you. A lot of the details are nonsense. But it got the smell right. It understood what computer culture felt like in the early 1980s. A smart kid in a bedroom, a modem, a pile of obscure hardware, weird blinking lights, late-night modem dialing, and the sense that if you knew just a little more than everybody else, you might accidentally open a door that you were never supposed to find. And that is why this movie still works on computer people. And so today I want to do two things at once. I want to go through Wargames and separate the real computer history from the Hollywood nonsense, and along the way I want to look at something even more interesting. What a real kid with an IMSAI could actually have done back in the day. Because underneath all of the Hollywood frosting, there's a real computer in there. In fact, there's a very real one. David Lightman's machine in Wargames is an IMSAI 8080 and not just some random box painted up to look futuristic. The IMSAI 8080 was a real S100 bus microcomputer introduced in 1975 and was sold as a kit or assembled system, and it really was featured in the film. And once you know that, the real question becomes even more fun. The question is not, was the computer real? Because it was. The question is, where did the movie actually cheat? And in reality, Wargames cheats all over the place. It cheats on what the front panel is doing. It cheats on what the monitor is doing. It cheats on the modem. It cheats on the voice. It cheats on the AI. And yet somehow, by cheating in exactly the right places, it winds up feeling more authentic than a lot of movies that were technically more careful. I want to go through the machine piece by piece and separate the parts that were real from the parts that were cinematic misdirection. Let's start with that bedroom rig itself, because this is where the movie earns a lot of the goodwill right out of the gate. The hardware is real period stuff. The movie production used an actual IMSAI 8080, an IMSAI FDC2 dual 8-inch floppy setup, an IMSAI IKB1 intelligent keyboard, and an Electro-Home monitor. It was a real 8-inch floppy system, and the supplier even notes roughly a megabyte of double-density storage on each of the discs, which in that era was serious business for a bedroom machine. So right away the movie gets some points for me, because while I didn't have an IMSAI back in the day, I have 3 IMSAIs now, and so I can't help but think of this movie every time I boot up off of an 8-inch floppy. The nice thing is that they did not give Matthew Broderick a magic silver box from the year 2080. They put him in front of real microcomputer gear that actually belonged to the culture that they were trying to depict. And that matters because it gives the whole thing a grounding that you can feel even if you don't know exactly what you're looking at. Now here comes the fake part number 1, that front panel. In the movie, the IMSAI front panel is practically a supporting actor, second to WOPR only. Lights are flashing, bits are dancing around, and the whole thing looks like the machine is sitting there in deep computational contemplation, one blinking light at a time. But that's not what those panels were actually for. In real life, the front panel was not there so you could watch your computer think. It was there because early microcomputers were still close cousins to mini computers and to lab gear. The switches and lights were for examining memory, depositing values, single-stepping instructions, resetting the machine, and bootstrapping the machine when you did not have the luxury of just typing run at a shell prompt. It was a control service, not a mood ring. Now, in reality, your front panel on an IMSAI will be in one of 3 states. It will be frozen as you're single-stepping through code, or it will be very busy when running, or just idle. And the idle pattern is the only time that you get a fun display because it has nothing else to do, so it blinks some lights. But when the machine is actually busy, the LEDs are generally too frenetic to actually read clearly. And Wargames absolutely juiced that for the camera. The movie machine was modified to produce a more convincing visual effect, including hardwiring a Restart 7 instruction so that the lights would put on a better show. The chassis was also bulked out with a bunch of dummy boards whose bus fingers were cut off so they looked impressive but didn't electrically interfere with the actual system. In other words, the movie IMSAI is real hardware, but it is also stage hardware. It's doing what Hollywood prop computers do best, looking busy and powerful. And honestly, I love that because it gives me a chance to quickly show you what the real panel actually does. At its most basic, you can inspect memory by entering a binary address on the switches and then inspecting that address. The lights indicate the binary value stored at the memory location that you specified with the switches. And similarly, you can deposit values right into memory. So first you enter the address on the address switches, and then you set the data switches, and then you deposit the data to whatever that address was. Wargames then uses real hardware with fake behavior, but it's fake behavior in service of making something visually legible to the audience, and that's a fair cheat. Now, fake number 2 is even better, the monitor. The movie wants you to believe that Matthew Broderick is sitting there typing away at the IMSAI and the on-screen display you're watching is all being generated right there by the system in real time. But no. According to later technical write-ups, the screen output was actually being generated by an off-screen CompuPro 816 system, not by an IMSAI. And so Broderick's keystrokes on the programmable IMSAI IKB1 keyboard were essentially queuing prearranged output from that off-screen machine to the Electro Home monitor. In other words, the keyboard was an actor, the IMSAI was an actor, and the machine really doing the screen work was hiding off-camera. And again, that's not a dirty trick, it's not deceptive, it's just practical filmmaking. Because if you're shooting a movie, you don't want your hero terminal depending on some flaky improvised demo that crashes on take 4 or that rolls the wrong text at the wrong time. You want repeatability, you want timing. You want to have the actor hit a key and have the machine perform whatever it is going to do on command. The cinematic version is instant, smooth, and dramatically paced. Unlike me, he doesn't type 6 characters forward and then delete 2 back because he doesn't make mistakes. The real version is slower, clunkier, and in a weird way more interesting because it makes you appreciate just how much patience and mechanical sympathy was required for early computing. Now, there's a big difference between computer activity that looks good on camera and versus what a teenager with an S100 box actually stared at for hours on end. Let's talk about the modem itself because this is where Wargames gives you one of the most iconic hacker images in movie history. The handset dropped into the acoustic coupler. The shot is so good that it's probably burned into the brains of half a generation. And once again, it's both real and fake at the same time. The machine in the movie is labeled as an IMSAI 212A modem, but according to the supplier account and later reconstructions, that modem was really a Surmatech, I'm not sure how you say that, 212A that had been repainted and relabeled for the film. The supplier even flat out said that he provided the only IMSAI 212A ever made because it was not an actual IMSAI product line item at all. And even better, the acoustic coupler that gets all the camera love was used mainly for visual effect. The real modem itself supported a direct line 1200 baud connection, so the coupler was there because it looked like computer magic, not because it was necessary anymore. That is just chef's kiss perfect, because it means the movie picked the most photogenic version of a real thing. Acoustic couplers were real, modems were real, dial-up access to remote systems was real. The whole culture of dialing around and poking at systems was real enough that the movie made people distinctly uncomfortable when it came out. But the handset in the cups thing is also movie language. It's tactile, it's noisy, it tells the audience, hey, a connection is happening, ka-chunk. You can't really do that with a beige box and a modular phone cord and an ATDT. Now, I'm 5th generation family hardware store, and back in the early 1980s, our family store was switching to computer-based ordering. So you punched all the UPC codes into a little box called a Telzon, and then you connected it to the phone with an acoustic coupler. Then you dialed our old rotary phone by hand, and it would upload the order to the mainframe. The noteworthy part is that it was send only. There was just a coupler on the microphone piece, not on the earpiece. And that means it was just sending blind into the wind and never receiving any confirmation until you heard the next morning that your order went through. Seems a bit suspect to me, but I guess it worked. The point of the story, though, is that the word modem stands for modulator, demodulator, as in send and receive. If you're sending only, you're just a modulator, not a modem. Which is to say that when I was a kid, we were so poor, we didn't even have a modem, we just had a mo. Moving past the modem trivia, the movie is smart enough to show Lightman using floppies, and that part is well grounded. The movie supplier says its production originally had not even thought of how the kid was actually loading the software, and he suggested the IMSAI FDC2 dual 8-inch floppy drive system for that exact reason. That is one of my favorite little details because it tells you that the prop side and the tech side were actually talking to each other. Somebody noticed that if this kid had a serious machine, he also had to have a plausible way of actually getting software onto it. It's a small thing, but it's exactly the sort of small thing that gives the movie credibility. And by the way, if you have an IMSAI FDC2 under your bed that you're not using, please reach out. I'd love to get a hold of any real IMSAI branded equipment that I can add to my system. One of the most iconic visual aspects of Wargames was the huge NORAD control room set with the giant vector displays. And as part of my research into them, because I was kind of fascinated with them, I even got to have lunch with a guy who worked on the real ones at Cheyenne Mountain. And in so doing, I learned that this is another part of the movie where it was liberally dosed with magic. Wargames made those giant NORAD displays feel like massive futuristic command center screens, but the trick was much smaller and more clever than that. The production used little Hewlett-Packard vector displays, roughly 6 inches across, to generate that imagery. They weren't raster screens like a television, they were monochrome vector CRTs, so instead of painting pixels line by line, they drew each line directly, brightly with an electron beam. That gives the graphics an incredibly crisp, clean look on film, which is a big part of why those screens still look so convincing today. And by the way, I've got a complete episode on the Wargames displays, and I even write code to run old video games on them, so check that out next. Now, as cool as the HP vector displays are, though, a tiny monochrome display doesn't magically become a giant glowing multicolor wall, so Hollywood did what Hollywood does best. They filmed multiple passes of the same graphics through different color filters and then stacked and composited those layers to create the blue-green look that we remember from the NORAD set. So what looks like one giant high-tech display wall is really a beautifully executed illusion. Many small vector monitors, separate color layers, and a lot of painstaking optical effects work. That's movie magic, 1983 style. Now we get to one of the bigger liberties in the whole film, and that is Joshua's voice. In Wargames, Joshua is not just a machine. Joshua is a presence. He talks, he waits, he speaks with timing. He almost follows the characters around the house like some kind of invisible electronic ghost. And his voice makes it the NORAD somehow too, which I never understood. So it's fantastic cinema, but it's not what home or institutional speech synthesis actually looked like in 1983.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking.
The production did not generate Joshua's speech on the fly on the IMSAI rig, obviously. Director John Badham had John Wood, who played Falcon, record Joshua's lines, and Wood was asked to read them backwards so that the words would come out unnaturally flat and carefully enunciated.
Excellent. It's been a long time. Can you explain the removal of your user account on June 23rd, 1973?
Badham's reasoning was that computer voices felt like they were stored words being pulled rapidly from a database, and he wanted that clipped mechanical quality. The more I think about it, the more it seems like a brilliantly low-tech solution to a high-tech cinematic problem. And here's where the real history is actually more fun. Speech synthesis absolutely existed by then. Votrax had already been around for years with systems like Type and Talk, and of course there was Speak and Spell, and the technology could be impressively advanced for that era. But it was still pretty rough, often phonetic, and often required bending your spelling to the machine's expectations. One account of Votrax notes exactly the kind of phonetic compromise. Circuit is spelt with a K in the middle, and generator becomes generator with a Y in the middle, and so on. DEC licensed Dennis Klatt's work in 1983 and released DEC Talk hardware in 1984, which I don't have and have never seen, with the first unit positioned as a standalone unit. So it was a box that sat on a desk, not some omnipresent house intelligence casually chatting with you from wherever you happen to be standing. And so Joshua's voice is a great example of Wargames combining real technical trends into one dramatically upgraded package. In summary then, yes, speech synthesis was real then, but no, it did not act or behave like that. And yes, there were talking systems, but no, your hacker rig was not likely to have a cinematic AI voice smoothly addressing you as if Hal had moved into the dorm room. And that brings us to the biggest liberty of all, Joshua himself. Because the real fantasy in Wargames is not the modem, it's not even in the IMSAI, and it's not the voice, it's the intelligence. Joshua is basically presented as a conversational strategic AI with speech, memory, context, a model of war, and enough human-facing behavior to be a little eerie. This was a giant leap for 1983. Not because there was nothing before it, but because the building blocks that did exist were still narrow and separate. Take Eliza. I first met Eliza on a TRS-80 Model 1 in a Radio Shack store, and for the first half hour, it was impressive. Eliza operates as a therapist of sorts. She remembered little pieces of the context you told her instead of back to you, and in a time decades before LLMs, the chat illusion was initially convincing. Joseph Weizenbaum's 1966 paper describes Eliza as a system that made certain kinds of natural language conversation possible by looking for keywords, applying decomposition rules, and then generating responses through reassembly rules. In other words, it could absolutely create the illusion of conversation, but under the hood it was just pattern matching and scripted transformation, not understanding in any sense. Weizenbaum basically said the magic collapses once you see the mechanism. This is a long way from Joshua. Joshua is not just chatting through typed text. He is speaking, reacting, modeling scenarios, running strategic simulations, and participating in the drama with a coherence that would have felt pretty miraculous back in 1983. And yet Wargames did not accurately predict large language models, and it did not depict a plausible 1983 AI system. What it did do was bundle together several real anxieties and real technologies of the moment: simulation, machine decision-making, dial-up access, speech synthesis, and the Eliza-style illusion that maybe there was a machine with more to it than you thought there really was. It took all of that and turned it into one memorable fictional character. That's not prediction, that's synthesis, and it's why Joshua feels so effective. So what could a real kid with an IMSAI actually have done? Well, quite a lot, actually. Not movie Joshua quite a lot, but a lot. A smart, motivated teenager with an IMSAI, with floppies, serial gear, and a modem could absolutely have learned to write software, automate dialing, connect to remote systems, poke at time-sharing services, and get himself into a respectable amount of trouble. Launching ballistic missiles was likely not on the menu, but changing your grades on the school's system just might be. The machine in Wargames is not implausible as a serious hobbyist system. In fact, that is exactly why the movie hits such a nerve. The hardware wasn't fantasy gear, it was recognizably adjacent to the real microcomputer world. I think that's the real secret of the movie. You might not have had a maxed out IMSAI, but it was at least plausible that somebody you knew or heard of might. And Wargames cheats on presentation, but not on texture. The movie still feels right because the cheats are wrapped around real hardware, real rituals, and real limitations. It understands that computers were not magical in that era. They were mechanical, finicky, procedural things. They clicked, they clunked, they loaded, they dialed, they blinked and waited. Even the lies are built out of truthful raw materials. And that, to me, is why Wargames deserves its place in retro computing lore. Not because it was accurate on the details, but because it was authentic in texture and taste and smell. It knew that if you wanted people to believe a teenager could accidentally brush up against the machinery of the Cold War, you did not start with a fantasy supercomputer in his bedroom. You started with something real, an IMSAI, a keyboard, a stack of floppies, a modem, a phone line, and then you cheated just enough to make the whole thing sing. And honestly, that may be the smartest thing the movie did, because 40 plus years later, here we are still talking about it. And more importantly, still believing it just a little. If you found today's episode entertaining, informative, or at least vaguely reassuring in the sense that your childhood movie memories have not been completely ruined, then I'd be honored if you would consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and all of the usual YouTube ritual sacrifices before you go. In the meantime and in between time, hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.